The morning sun cast long shadows through the broken windows of the abandoned Ford assembly plant, where Marcus Rivera crouched behind a makeshift barricade of welded steel and concrete blocks, his weathered hands gripping a modified hunting rifle that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. 6 months had passed since the world ended, 6 months since the first wave of infected had torn through Detroit like a plague of biblical proportions, and now the former Army medic found himself responsible for 12 other souls who looked to him for answers he didn't have. The group had turned the old automotive factory into something resembling a fortress, with Elena Kowalski's engineering expertise helping them create a network of elevated walkways, reinforced barriers, and ingenious early warning systems that had kept them alive when so many others had fallen. Elena worked tirelessly in the corner, her blonde hair tied back as she modified their latest creation, a crossbow that could fire multiple bolts simultaneously, while young Jake Thompson, barely 17 but aged beyond his years by the horrors he'd witnessed, kept watch from the observation tower they'd built in the factory's highest section. Rebecca Martinez, who had been teaching 4th grade when the outbreak began, now spent her days rationing their dwindling food supplies and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the group, while David Park used his mechanical skills to keep their vehicles running and their generators humming with precious fuel they could barely afford to burn. The compound had served them well through the bitter Michigan winter and the chaos of spring, but Marcus could feel the walls closing in as their ammunition ran low and their food stores dwindled to less than a week's worth of meager rations. That morning brought news that chilled him more than any Detroit winter ever could. A massive horde was moving toward their location, thousands of the infected drawn by some unknown force, their shambling forms creating a dark tide that stretched beyond the horizon. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see them in the distance, a sea of rotting flesh and empty eyes that moved with an unsettling coordination that suggested something more than mere animal instinct was driving them forward. The zombies had been evolving, becoming more cunning and dangerous with each passing month, and Marcus had noticed disturbing changes in their behavior. Some seemed to remember fragments of their former lives, others had learned to use simple tools, and a few appeared to be directing the movements of larger groups. The radio crackled to life with a transmission that made everyone in the compound stop what they were doing and listen with desperate hope, a voice claiming to represent a government facility high in the Rocky Mountains, promising sanctuary for any survivors who could make the treacherous journey across the infected wasteland that America had become. Elena looked up from her work, her blue eyes reflecting the same mixture of hope and skepticism that Marcus felt gnawing at his gut, while Jake climbed down from his perch to join the heated discussion that erupted among the group about whether the transmission was legitimate or simply another trap set by desperate humans who had lost their humanity along with their civilization. Rebecca clutched the radio transcript in her trembling hands, her teacher's instincts telling her to analyze every word for hidden meanings, while David wiped grease from his fingers and pointed out the practical impossibilities of moving their entire group across 2,000 miles of hostile territory with limited fuel and supplies. The debate grew more intense as the day wore on, with some members of their small community arguing that they should fortify their position and fight the approaching horde, while others insisted that their only chance of survival lay in abandoning everything they had built and attempting the desperate journey westward toward an uncertain salvation. As night fell and the distant moans of the approaching horde grew louder, Marcus found himself faced with the most difficult decision of his life, a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of every person who had placed their trust in his leadership during these dark months when the dead walked the earth and the living struggled to remember what it meant to be human. The factory's lights flickered ominously as their fuel reserves reached critical levels, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their walls, thousands of hungry corpses continued their relentless march toward the last bastion of hope in the Motor City's industrial graveyard. The emergency meeting in the factory's main assembly area crackled with tension as Marcus Rivera watched his carefully constructed community begin to fracture under the weight of an impossible decision, the harsh fluorescent lights powered by their failing generator casting eerie shadows on faces that had grown gaunt from months of rationed meals and sleepless nights. Elena Kowalski stood beside her workbench, her engineering mind calculating odds and logistics while her heart wrestled with the emotional reality of potentially abandoning the only secure home they had known since the world collapsed, her voice steady but strained as she explained that their vehicles could carry only 7 people with enough supplies for the cross-country journey, leaving 5 members of their family to face the approaching horde alone. Jake Thompson, his teenage frame deceptively thin but muscles hardened by months of manual labor and survival, argued passionately that they should all stay and fight, his young voice cracking with emotion as he described the elaborate defense systems they had built together, the trust they had forged in blood and sacrifice, and his refusal to abandon the people who had become his surrogate family after losing his parents in the early days of the outbreak. Rebecca Martinez clutched a worn photograph of her former students, her teacher's instincts warring with her survival reflexes as she voiced what everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to say, that splitting up would likely mean death for both groups, either from the zombie horde or from the countless dangers that lurked along the 2,000-mile journey to an uncertain sanctuary that might not even exist. David Park, ever the pragmatist, spread out maps across a workbench and traced possible routes with his grease-stained finger, pointing out the major cities they would need to navigate, the fuel stops that might still have usable gasoline, and the mountain passes that could trap them in winter weather, his mechanical expertise making it clear that their odds of survival decreased dramatically with every mile they would have to travel. The debate raged through the night as the distant sounds of the approaching horde grew steadily louder, creating an ominous soundtrack to their desperate deliberations, until Elena's motion sensors detected movement in their outer perimeter and sent the entire group scrambling to their defensive positions with weapons drawn and hearts pounding. What they discovered in the pale pre-dawn light defied everything they thought they knew about the infected, 3 zombies working together to dismantle their early warning system, using pieces of rebar and chunks of concrete as crude tools, while a 4th creature that retained enough intelligence to direct the others pointed out specific weak points in their defenses with jerky but unmistakably purposeful gestures. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he watched through his rifle scope, realizing that these weren't the mindless shamblers they had been fighting for months, but something far more dangerous, infected humans who had retained fragments of their cognitive abilities and were now applying those skills to overcome the barriers that had kept his people safe. The attack came just after sunrise, a coordinated assault that exploited every weakness the intelligent zombies had identified, forcing the defenders to fall back to their secondary positions as waves of infected poured through breached sections of their perimeter, their moans and snarls mixing with the crack of gunfire and the screams of people fighting for their lives. When the smoke cleared and the last zombie fell, they had lost 2 members of their group, Maria Santos, a nurse who had helped Marcus treat countless injuries, torn apart while defending the medical station, and little Tommy Walsh, only 8 years old, who had been caught in the collapse of their eastern watchtower, his small body crushed beneath tons of debris as the structure fell. The grief was overwhelming, but Marcus knew they couldn't afford to mourn properly, not with the main horde still approaching and their defenses compromised beyond repair, his voice hollow but determined as he made the announcement that would tear his community apart. Half would stay to make a final stand and buy time for the others, while the remaining 7 would attempt the desperate journey across zombie-infested America toward a hope that might prove to be nothing more than a cruel mirage. In the wasteland their country had become. The convoy of 2 armored vehicles rolled through the desolate Michigan countryside under a gray October sky, their modified engines growling softly as Marcus Rivera navigated around abandoned cars and debris that littered Highway 94. His knuckles white on the steering wheel as he fought to suppress the guilt that gnawed at his conscience like a persistent infection. Behind him sat Elena Kowalski, her laptop connected to a makeshift radar system she had cobbled together from salvaged electronics, the screen showing scattered clusters of movement that could be zombie hordes, wild animals, or other survivor groups moving through the wasteland that stretched endlessly before them. Jake Thompson rode in the second vehicle with Rebecca Martinez and David Park, along with 2 other survivors who had volunteered for the desperate journey, Angela Foster, a former police officer whose tactical experience had proven invaluable during their escape from Detroit, and Michael Chen, a paramedic whose medical skills complemented Marcus's combat training in keeping their small group alive. The landscape they traveled through bore little resemblance to the America any of them remembered, with burned-out towns dotting the horizon like broken teeth, their main streets choked with weeds and debris while packs of feral dogs roamed through empty neighborhoods where zombies had long since consumed or converted every human resident. Elena's scanner detected their first major threat just outside of Kalamazoo, where a group of survivors had established what appeared to be a functioning community complete with solar panels, vegetable gardens, and defensive walls made from shipping containers. But Marcus's military instincts screamed danger when he noticed the way the sentries moved with predatory confidence and the suspicious absence of children or elderly people in their supposed refuge. The meeting with the Kalamazoo group's leader, a charismatic man named Ryan Walsh who claimed to be a former city councilman, revealed the harsh reality of survival in the New World. These weren't refugees seeking mutual aid, but raiders who had turned to hunting other survivors for supplies, their friendly demeanor masking the cold calculation of predators who saw Marcus's group as fresh prey rather than potential allies. The confrontation erupted when Angela spotted human bones scattered behind their compound's makeshift kitchen, her police training recognizing the telltale marks of butchery that suggested these supposed survivors had resorted to cannibalism to sustain their community, forcing Marcus to make a split-second decision that saved their lives but cost them precious ammunition and fuel as they fought their way out of the trap. As they fled westward with Walsh's raiders in pursuit, Elena made a discovery that chilled them all to the bone. The zombies they encountered were displaying increasingly sophisticated behavior, with some infected individuals retaining enough cognitive function to recognize and avoid their vehicle's engine noise, while others had learned to set primitive traps using tripwires and deadfalls that suggested a level of planning ability that defied everything the medical community had believed about the infection's effects on brain function. The revelation came during their approach to Chicago, where David's mechanical expertise proved crucial in modifying their vehicle's exhaust systems to run more quietly, while Rebecca used her teaching background to analyze patterns in zombie behavior that suggested the infected were somehow communicating with each other through subsonic vocalizations that human ears couldn't detect. Jake's sharp eyes spotted the first evidence of organized zombie activity when they reached the outskirts of the Windy City, barricades made from overturned cars and debris that appeared deliberately constructed rather than randomly scattered, creating channels that would funnel living humans toward specific areas where large groups of infected waited in coordinated ambush positions. The sight of Chicago's skyline, with several skyscrapers showing signs of massive fires and structural collapse, drove home the magnitude of their undertaking as Marcus realized they would need to navigate through nearly 3 million infected former residents to reach the other side of the metropolitan area, their fuel supplies barely adequate for the detour around the city and their food reserves dwindling to less than 4 days of careful rationing. As night fell and they prepared to make camp in an abandoned truck stop, Elena's motion detectors registered movement in the darkness beyond their perimeter, but this time the signatures were different, larger, more coordinated, and moving with the deliberate patience of intelligent predators who understood that time was on their side in this deadly game of survival where one mistake could mean the difference between reaching the promised sanctuary in the Rocky Mountains and becoming just another set of bones scattered across the American wasteland. The abandoned Chicago Transit Authority tunnel beneath the Loop District echoed with the sound of dripping water and distant moaning as Marcus Rivera led his group through the labyrinthine subway system, their flashlight beams cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself, while overhead the streets teemed with hundreds of thousands of infected who had transformed America's third-largest city into a sprawling necropolis where the living were unwelcome intruders. Elena Kowalski's modified tablet displayed a rough map of the underground network, her engineering background helping her navigate the complex system of maintenance tunnels, abandoned stations, and utility corridors that offered their only hope of crossing the metropolitan area without attracting the attention of the massive zombie hordes that controlled the surface. Though even down here in the relative safety of the underground, they could hear the constant shuffling and scratching of infected who had found their way into the tunnels. Jake Thompson moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to survive by becoming invisible, his teenage reflexes serving him well as he scouted ahead through the darkness, while Rebecca Martinez struggled to maintain her composure in the claustrophobic environment that reminded her too much of the basement where she had hidden for 3 days during the initial outbreak, listening to her neighbors being torn apart by creatures that had once been friends and colleagues. The first sign that something was fundamentally different about Chicago's infected population came when David Park discovered a section of tunnel that had been deliberately barricaded with shopping carts, construction materials, and human bones arranged in patterns too complex to be random, suggesting that whatever intelligence guided these creatures had evolved far beyond the basic pack behavior they had observed in smaller cities. Angela Foster's police training kicked in when she noticed drag marks in the tunnel floor leading toward a side passage, her tactical instincts warning her that they were walking into a carefully prepared hunting ground where infected predators had learned to channel their prey through predetermined routes. But before she could voice her concerns, the group encountered something that defied every assumption they had made about the nature of the zombie plague. Standing in the dim light of an abandoned platform was a figure that looked almost human, its clothes torn but not completely destroyed, its posture upright rather than the typical shambling gait of the infected, and most disturbing of all, its eyes showed a flicker of intelligence as it turned to regard the approaching survivors with what could only be described as calculating interest. Marcus raised his rifle but hesitated when the creature, whom Elena would later refer to as the shepherd, made a sound that was part moan, part whistle, part something else entirely, a complex vocalization that seemed to carry meaning and purpose as it echoed through the tunnels and was answered by similar calls from the darkness ahead and behind their position. The realization that they had walked into a trap came too late as infected figures began emerging from side passages and maintenance alcoves, their movements coordinated and purposeful as they formed a loose circle around the survivors, but what truly terrified Marcus was the way the shepherd seemed to be directing their actions with subtle gestures and vocalizations, as if it retained enough cognitive function to serve as a field commander for its undead army. The fighting that followed was unlike anything they had experienced before, as the infected displayed tactical awareness that included flanking maneuvers, coordinated attacks, and the ability to adapt their strategy when their initial assault failed, forcing the survivors to expend precious ammunition while fighting their way through creatures that had learned from previous encounters with living humans. Rebecca Martinez screamed as one of the infected grabbed her backpack during the chaos, its claws raking across her shoulder and tearing through her jacket, but she managed to break free without realizing that the creature's nails had penetrated deep enough to draw blood, the tiny wounds already beginning to burn with the telltale signs of infection that she would conceal from her companions out of fear and denial. The group's desperate flight through the tunnel system eventually led them to an abandoned military checkpoint where Michael Chen's medical training proved invaluable in treating their wounds, while David's mechanical skills helped them breach the security doors that protected a cache of military-grade weapons and intelligence files that revealed the true scope of the disaster. Satellite images showing infected populations in major cities organizing into massive supercolonies, communication intercepts suggesting that some zombies had retained enough brain function to use simple tools and plan complex operations, and most chilling of all, reports from the Rocky Mountain facility indicating that the promised sanctuary might already be under siege by evolved infected who had learned to coordinate attacks across vast distances through methods that military scientists were only beginning to understand. The abandoned grain silo outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, provided temporary shelter from a brutal October storm, but the tension inside the concrete structure was more dangerous than any weather as Rebecca Martinez huddled in the corner, her fever spiking despite the antibiotics Michael Chen had given her for what she claimed was just a minor infection from their escape through Chicago's tunnels. Marcus Rivera watched her with growing suspicion, his military medical training recognizing the telltale signs of zombie infection that Rebecca was desperately trying to hide, the pale, clammy skin, the way she flinched from bright light, and most damning of all, the distinctive network of dark veins that was beginning to spread from the wounds on her shoulder like poison coursing through her bloodstream. Elena Kowalski's engineering mind was focused on their dwindling fuel supplies and the mathematical impossibility of reaching the Rocky Mountains before winter locked the high passes in snow and ice, but she couldn't ignore the way Rebecca had been avoiding physical contact with the group, especially with Jake Thompson, whose youthful optimism seemed to cause her actual pain as the infection progressed and her humanity slowly ebbed away. The confrontation came when Angela Foster, her police instincts finally overriding her desire to believe Rebecca's increasingly frantic denials, cornered the former teacher in the silo's storage area and demanded to see the wounds that Rebecca had been keeping covered with layers of bandages and clothing, her voice gentle but firm as she explained that they all deserved to know the truth about what they were facing. Rebecca's breakdown was heartbreaking to witness, her sobs echoing off the concrete walls as she confessed that she had been bitten during their encounter with the shepherd's coordinated attack, her teacher's instincts warring with the growing hunger that gnawed at her consciousness like a living thing trying to claw its way out of her skull, begging them to end her suffering before she became the monster that haunted her nightmares. Jake Thompson, despite being the youngest member of their group, stepped forward with a maturity that surprised everyone, his voice steady as he volunteered to stay with Rebecca during her final hours, reading to her from a water-damaged copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that she had salvaged from a destroyed library, his presence providing comfort even as her condition deteriorated and her lucid moments became increasingly rare. The decision of what to do about Rebecca was still being debated when their lookout spotted a convoy of military vehicles approaching from the east, their camouflage paint and professional formation initially raising hopes that they had finally encountered legitimate government forces, until Angela's tactical experience noticed details that made her blood run cold. The vehicles showed signs of hasty modification. The soldiers moved with the undisciplined aggression of raiders rather than the crisp efficiency of real military personnel. And most disturbing of all, the back of one truck was filled with cages containing what appeared to be living human beings. David Park's mechanical expertise proved crucial when he recognized the vehicles as stolen National Guard equipment that had been modified with armor plating and weapon mounts, his knowledge of military hardware helping him identify weak points in their defenses. But it was Jake's quick thinking that saved them when he realized the approaching soldiers weren't there to rescue survivors but to capture them for purposes that became horrifyingly clear when their leader, a man calling himself Colonel Briggs, explained his operation. The rogue military unit had established what they called research facilities throughout the Midwest, where they conducted experiments on living subjects to understand the zombie infection, their twisted logic convincing them that the ends justified the means as they tortured survivors in the name of finding a cure, though Marcus's medical background told him that their methods were more about satisfying sadistic impulses than advancing scientific knowledge. The battle that erupted when Marcus refused to surrender his people was brutal and desperate, with David Park making the ultimate sacrifice by detonating an improvised explosive device that destroyed the raiders' primary vehicle but cost him his life in the process, his final words urging the others to remember that their humanity was worth fighting for even when the world seemed determined to strip it away. As the survivors fought their way clear of the ambush, Rebecca Martinez made her own choice, using her remaining human consciousness to warn them about the soldiers' flanking maneuver before deliberately exposing herself to enemy fire, her sacrifice buying precious seconds that allowed Jake and the others to escape while she faced her fate with the dignity of a teacher who had spent her final days protecting the children in her care, just as she had always done before the world ended and transformed ordinary people into heroes, monsters, and sometimes both. The first blizzard of winter struck as Marcus Rivera and his remaining 4 companions reached the Nebraska-Colorado border, their battered vehicles struggling through howling winds and knee-deep snow that transformed the already treacherous landscape into a frozen hell where visibility dropped to mere yards and the slightest mechanical failure could mean death for everyone aboard. Elena Kowalski hunched over her improvised heating system, her engineering skills pushed to their absolute limits as she tried to keep their engines from freezing while simultaneously monitoring the energy signatures of what local survivors had warned them about, a 50-mile stretch of territory controlled by zombies that displayed intelligence levels far beyond anything they had previously encountered, creatures that locals whispered about in terrified voices, calling them the Collective, and describing coordinated attacks that suggested a hive mind mentality among the infected population. Jake Thompson had grown into his role as the group's primary scout and strategist, his youthful reflexes and sharp tactical mind making him invaluable as they approached what everyone simply called the Gauntlet, a nightmarish corridor through the Colorado foothills where the infected had somehow learned to use the terrain itself as a weapon, creating elaborate trap systems that channeled survivors into predetermined killing zones where hundreds of zombies waited in perfect coordination. Angela Foster's police training proved essential as she studied the reports they had gathered from other survivor groups, her analytical mind recognizing patterns in the attacks that suggested the superintelligent zombies were learning from each encounter with living humans, adapting their tactics and sharing information through methods that defied current understanding of how the infection affected brain function and cognitive ability. Michael Chen's medical expertise had become increasingly crucial as the stress of their losses and the constant threat of death began taking its toll on everyone's mental health, his paramedic background helping him recognize the signs of trauma and exhaustion that could lead to fatal mistakes in judgment when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death in their desperate race against time and weather. The approach to the Gauntlet revealed the true scope of what they were facing, an entire ecosystem of evolved zombies that had transformed the landscape into a living trap, with infected creatures stationed at strategic points along ridgelines and in hidden valleys, their positions chosen with mathematical precision to create overlapping fields of engagement that would prevent any escape once the killing began. Elena's most ambitious invention yet proved to be their salvation, a series of mechanical decoys equipped with speakers and heat sources that could mimic human signatures well enough to draw zombie attention away from their actual route, her engineering genius creating an elaborate shell game that allowed them to navigate through the outer perimeter of the collective's territory while the infected swarmed toward false targets. The psychological toll of witnessing the zombies' tactical coordination was almost unbearable, as Marcus watched through binoculars while hundreds of infected moved with the precision of a well-drilled military unit, their actions suggesting not just retained intelligence but active communication and strategic planning that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of death and consciousness. Jake's emergence as a natural leader became apparent during their most desperate hour, when a mechanical failure left them stranded in the middle of the gauntlet with zombie forces converging from 3 directions. His calm voice and clear thinking rallying the group to implement Elena's backup plan while Marcus found himself following the teenager's tactical suggestions with the respect he would normally reserve for a seasoned military commander. The revelation of Marcus's buried trauma came flooding back as he faced the coordinated zombie assault, memories of his first military unit being overrun in the early days of the outbreak, the guilt and survivor's syndrome that had driven him to become obsessively protective of any group under his command. His hands shaking as he realized that once again he might lose everyone he cared about to enemies that moved with inhuman precision and limitless patience. The breakthrough came when Elena discovered that the super-intelligent zombies' coordination system had a fatal flaw. Their reliance on subsonic communication made them vulnerable to specific frequencies that could disrupt their ability to share information. Her hastily constructed sonic disruptor creating windows of confusion that allowed the survivors to exploit gaps in what had seemed like an impenetrable defensive network. As they finally emerged from the gauntlet's killing fields and saw the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains rising before them like a promise of salvation, the group had been fundamentally changed by their ordeal. No longer the desperate refugees who had fled Detroit months earlier but hardened survivors who had faced the worst that the New World could offer and somehow found the strength to keep moving forward toward an uncertain destiny that lay hidden somewhere in the high country ahead. The massive steel gates of the Rocky Mountain Research Facility emerged from the morning mist like something from a dream, their imposing presence set against the backdrop of snow-covered peaks that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But Marcus Rivera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as he studied the complex through his binoculars and noticed details that made his combat-trained instinct scream warnings. Elena Kowalski's portable scanner detected sophisticated electronic surveillance systems that seemed far too advanced for a simple refugee camp, while the facility's layout reminded Angela Foster of the maximum security prisons she had visited during her police career, complete with multiple layers of perimeter defenses, guard towers positioned at strategic intervals, and what appeared to be holding areas rather than residential quarters for survivors. Jake Thompson's sharp eyes picked out the most disturbing detail of all. While the facility clearly housed hundreds of people, there was a conspicuous absence of children, elderly individuals, or anyone who appeared weak or injured, suggesting that this supposed sanctuary had very specific criteria for determining who deserved protection and who did not. The initial meeting with Dr. Victoria Hartwell, the facility's chief administrator, revealed a woman whose scientific credentials were impeccable but whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had made peace with sacrificing individuals for what she believed was the greater good of humanity's survival. Her welcoming words carefully chosen to reassure the new arrivals while revealing nothing about the true nature of the research being conducted within the heavily fortified complex. Michael Chen's medical background helped him recognize the signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the facility's operations. The staff members they encountered moved with the nervous energy of people under constant stress. Medical equipment was conspicuously absent from common areas despite this being supposedly a research center, and most telling of all, that the survivors they met seemed reluctant to make eye contact or engage in casual conversation, as if they had been trained to avoid revealing too much about their experiences. The tour of the facility that Dr. Hartwell provided was clearly designed to impress rather than inform, showcasing impressive laboratories filled with sophisticated equipment while carefully avoiding entire sections of the complex that remained locked and off-limits to visitors. Her explanations about their breakthrough research becoming increasingly vague when Marcus pressed for specific details about their progress toward developing a cure for the zombie infection. The shocking truth emerged when Angela's police instincts led her to investigate an area that was supposedly under construction, where she discovered holding cells containing living survivors who showed signs of deliberate infection and systematic experimentation, their medical charts revealing that the facility had been intentionally exposing human subjects to controlled doses of the zombie virus in order to study the progression of the disease and test potential treatments. Elena's engineering expertise proved crucial when she managed to access the facility's computer systems and uncovered files that revealed the government's darkest secret: the zombie outbreak had not been an accident or natural disaster, but the result of a military bioweapons program that had gone catastrophically wrong when a containment breach at a classified laboratory released the engineered virus into the general population 6 months earlier. The revelation that the so-called cure required massive numbers of living test subjects to perfect, and that the Rocky Mountain facility had been luring survivors from across the country to serve as unwilling experimental subjects, shattered any illusions the group might have had about finding genuine sanctuary in a world where even the promise of salvation had been corrupted by human ambition and scientific hubris. Dr. Hartwell's true nature became apparent when she calmly explained that Marcus and his companions would be valuable additions to their research program, their diverse backgrounds and proven survival skills making them ideal candidates for testing the latest generation of experimental treatments, her clinical detachment revealing someone who had lost all connection to basic human empathy in pursuit of what she genuinely believed was humanity's only hope for survival. The alarm systems began wailing just as Marcus realized they had walked into another trap, but this time the danger came not from human treachery but from something far worse. Elena's instruments detected a massive zombie army approaching the facility from multiple directions, thousands of super-intelligent infected drawn by some unknown force that had overcome every defensive measure the facility's designers had put in place. As emergency lights bathed the complex in an eerie red glow and automated voices announced the beginning of lockdown procedures, Marcus found himself facing the ultimate irony. In order to escape from the people who wanted to use them as experimental subjects, they would have to survive an assault by the very creatures that the facility's twisted research was supposedly trying to defeat, their fate now tied to the survival of the same institution that had betrayed their trust and perverted their hopes of finding genuine sanctuary in a world gone mad. The thunderous roar of thousands of infected voices echoed across the Rocky Mountain peaks as Marcus Rivera found himself in the impossible position of fighting alongside Dr. Victoria Hartwell and her research staff against an enemy that had evolved far beyond anything they had previously encountered, the facility's defensive walls crumbling under the coordinated assault of zombies that moved with military precision and displayed tactical awareness that suggested they had learned to wage war against the living with terrifying efficiency. Elena Kowalski's final masterpiece emerged from the chaos of battle as she worked frantically in the facility's engineering bay, her hands flying over salvaged components and laboratory equipment to construct a sonic amplification device that could potentially disrupt the subsonic communication network that allowed the super-intelligent zombies to coordinate their attacks across vast distances. Her engineering genius pushed to its absolute limits as explosions rocked the building and the sound of breaking glass announced each new breach in their rapidly failing defenses. Jake Thompson had transformed completely from the frightened teenager who had fled Detroit months earlier into a natural battlefield commander whose tactical instincts rivaled those of seasoned military veterans, his voice cutting through the chaos as he directed the facility's defenders to strategic positions while coordinating with Angela Foster to establish overlapping fields of fire that could slow the zombie advance long enough for Elena to complete her desperate gambit. The revelation that the experimental cure actually worked came at the worst possible moment, as Dr. Hartwell's research data showed that her twisted experiments had indeed produced a viable treatment for the zombie infection, but the manufacturing process required resources and facilities that would take months to scale up to meaningful production levels, making the breakthrough simultaneously humanity's greatest hope and most bitter irony as the facility faced imminent destruction. Michael Chen's paramedic training proved invaluable as he moved through the battle-torn corridors treating wounded defenders while simultaneously helping Dr. Hartwell's team prepare emergency doses of the experimental cure, his medical knowledge bridging the gap between field medicine and laboratory science as they worked to save as many lives as possible before the facility's defenses collapsed entirely. The massive zombie army attacking the facility included evolved variants that defied every assumption about the infection's limitations, creatures that could climb vertical surfaces with spider-like agility, others that had developed the ability to spit corrosive substances that could dissolve metal barriers, and most terrifying of all, a new breed of infected that retained enough cognitive function to use advanced weapons and operate complex machinery with deadly precision. Angela Foster's law enforcement background became crucial during the darkest hour of the siege, when a group of the most intelligent zombies managed to breach the facility's central command center and began systematically disabling the automated defense systems, her tactical expertise and combat training allowing her to lead a desperate counterattack that restored partial control over the complex's security network. The turning point came when Elena's sonic disruptor finally activated, sending waves of specifically calibrated sound frequencies throughout the facility and surrounding area that caused the attacking zombies to lose their coordination and begin attacking each other in confused rage, their hive-mind communication network shattered by the electronic warfare device that had been cobbled together from laboratory equipment and Elena's brilliant understanding of the infected creature's neurological vulnerabilities. Marcus Rivera's leadership was tested to its absolute limits as he made the impossible decision to sacrifice sections of the facility to save others, his military training warring with his protective instincts as he ordered the detonation of entire wings of the complex to create firebreaks that could slow the zombie advance while Elena's device gradually expanded its area of effect and began turning the tide of battle. The final assault came when Dr. Hartwell herself made the ultimate sacrifice, using her intimate knowledge of the facility's systems to trigger a controlled overload of the main power reactor that would eliminate the remaining zombie forces but also destroy most of the research data and equipment needed to mass-produce the cure, her last words expressing hope that the survivors would find a way to rebuild civilization and honor the memory of those who had died to make that future possible. As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains and the last of the disoriented zombies stumbled away from the ruins of the facility, Jake Thompson stood among the handful of survivors who had lived through humanity's darkest hour, his young face marked by experiences that had aged him decades in mere months, but his eyes still holding the spark of hope that would drive him to become one of the leaders who would guide humanity's slow recovery from the brink of extinction. The cure worked, but at a cost that left America's survivors scattered across a continent littered with the bones of civilization, their greatest challenge no longer the zombies that had nearly destroyed their species, but the monumental task of rebuilding a world where trust, compassion, and hope could flourish once again in the wasteland their country had become.